Welcome back to the True Crime Collection, where Jen and Brian are diving into the world's most chilling crimes. From unsolved mysteries to dark endeavors, they uncover the stories that will keep you hooked. This is the True Crime Collection.
Okay, picture this. It's Cleveland, 1930s. The Depression has hit hard.
Yeah.
Industries are just silent. There's this despair hanging in the air. But in the shadows of this place called Kingsbury Run, well, a darkness, much more sinister, is starting to grow. This is the story of the Cleveland Torso murders. And this killer, they called him the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run.
Right.
He preyed on the city's most vulnerable. And that's what we're doing today. We're diving deep into this whole unsolved mystery. The victims, the methods, the suspects.
Yeah.
We're going to try and put together this puzzle that has baffled investigators for, gosh, almost a century.
It's a case that really gets right to the core of a city in crisis,
Yeah.
as much as it is about a really brutal killer.
Right.
I think to really grasp the fear that gripped Cleveland, I think we have to understand the setting a bit.
Okay, so set the stage for us. What was life actually like in 1930s Cleveland?
Well, imagine unemployment, like soaring close to 50% in a city that was just devastated by the Depression. People losing their homes, livelihoods, their hope.
Yeah.
And the contrast is stark. You have these wealthy neighborhoods like Cleveland Heights,
All right.
Shaker Heights, and then you have Kingsbury Run.
Kingsbury Run, that name keeps coming up.
Yeah.
When we talk about this case, what was it like?
Kingsbury Run was this low-lying area, almost swampy, near the industrial center of the city. And it became this dumping ground, not just for trash, but for the city's most desperate.
Oh, wow.
People living in these makeshift Hoovervilles, struggling to survive. It's this forgotten world, of poverty, crime.
Right.
And it became the killer's hunting ground.
And these bodies, the discovery of them, it must have sent shockwaves, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Through a city already dealing with so much.
Yeah.
Where did it all begin?
Well, September 1935, you have this chilling premonition, I guess you could say, of what's to come. A dock worker finds the lower half of a woman's torso washed ashore on Lake Erie.
Oh, my gosh.
And they called her the Lady of the Lake.
The Lady of the Lake, wow.
Kind of this haunting name that would become synonymous with the torso murder.
Just the torso. Was there anything else?
They did recover some body parts, but her head was missing. Made identification impossible.
Oh, wow.
At the time, nobody knew, the full horror that was about to unfold, but this gruesome discovery, it set this chilling precedent,
Wow. So when did the murders, as we kind of understand them today, when did they actually begin?
Well, the same day that the Lady of the Lake was found, two teenage boys made a horrifying discovery in Kingsbury Run. The decapitated remains of a man. He was later identified as Edward Andrassy, a small-time criminal known to frequent the area.
Yeah.
And tragically, it wasn't an isolated incident.
Oh, no, there were more victims.
Yes.
Found so close together.
Another body, this one unidentified, was found near Andrassy.
Jeez.
Both men had been emasculated and, unsettlingly, showed signs of exposure to a chemical preservative.
A chemical preservative. What was the purpose of that?
It's one of the most baffling elements of this case. Was it to mask the smell of decomposition, to preserve the bodies as trophies, or something else?
Right.
I mean, it adds this really chilling layer of complexity to an already horrific crime.
It's not just murder. It's methodical.
Yeah.
Almost ritualistic.
Yeah.
Like almost a calling card.
The Mad Butcher was just getting started. Over the next 4 years, at least 12 more victims would be found, their bodies scattered across the city bearing the same gruesome hallmarks.
12 victims, and they all shared these specific mutilations.
Most were dismembered, often decapitated, making identification incredibly difficult. The chemical treatment continued. A detail as eerie as it is puzzling.
Yeah.
It set these murders apart from anything investigators had ever seen.
It sounds like the killer was deliberately trying to make identification difficult.
Right.
Almost like taunting the police. Were the victims connected in any way?
That's what made this case so terrifying for the people of Cleveland. Most of the victims were from the margins of society. Transients, alcoholics, sex workers, people less likely to be missed, easily forgotten.
Right.
It felt like anyone could vanish into the shadows of Kingsbury Run.
So you have a city that's already gripped by fear and uncertainty because of the Depression.
Absolutely.
And then this brutal killer emerges.
Yeah.
And he's targeting the most vulnerable. It must have felt like a nightmare come to life.
It really was. The brutality of these murders, coupled with the already existing hardships of the Depression, it just amplified that sense of dread that permeated the city.
Yeah.
You know what? To really get a sense of what the killer was capable of, I think we should look at some specific cases.
Okay, but I do want to warn you, this is where the details become quite disturbing. If you're sensitive to this type of content, you might want to skip ahead a few minutes.
All right, so in January of 1936, a torso wrapped in burlap was discovered near the Cleveland Flats, an area known for its industry and shipping not far from Kingsbury Run. Okay. Like other victims, he was decapitated, castrated, but this case had a chillingly meticulous element to it.
What was different about this victim?
Well, his body had been carefully cleaned before being discarded.
Oh, wow.
The precision of the cuts, the cleanliness of the remains, it suggested someone with anatomical knowledge.
So someone like a doctor, or maybe a butcher with experience breaking down animal carcasses.
Exactly. This wasn't the work of an amateur.
Right.
This was someone who understood the human body,
Yep.
someone who knew how to dismember with precision.
Wow. And instead of simply being horrifying, this meticulous cleaning, it suggests something else to me.
What's that?
Almost like dehumanizing the victims, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Further distancing the killer from their actions.
It could be an attempt to dehumanize the victims, further distancing the killer from their actions. Yeah, you're right.
That's a chilling thought.
It is.
It takes the brutality to a whole new level.
It does.
Right.
And then in June of that same year, the torso of a woman in her mid-30s was found along the banks of the Cuyahoga River. Limbs severed, head missing. And again, the chemical treatment.
So the killer wasn't just targeting men?
No, although the majority of the victims were male.
Okay.
This woman's case is particularly interesting because witnesses reported seeing a man lurking near the river a few days before her body was discovered.
Did anyone get a good look at him? Were there any leads?
Unfortunately, not really. Descriptions were vague, like a man in a dark coat and hat.
Right.
Could have been anyone.
Yeah.
But it does suggest that the killer was stalking victims, maybe choosing them based on their vulnerability and isolation.
So we're starting to see a pattern here, right? The victims, the methods, the locations. But what about the why? What could possibly drive a person to commit such horrific acts?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The one that investigators have wrestled with for decades.
Right.
And there are a number of theories, some more plausible than others.
Let's start with, I guess, the most obvious one. Was this simply a case of someone targeting the homeless out of hatred or prejudice?
It's a common assumption, and given the social and economic upheaval of the time, it's certainly possible. There was a lot of resentment towards those who were perceived as burdens on society.
So the killer could have been acting out of some twisted sense of social cleansing.
It's possible. While that fits with the choice of victims, the brutality seems to go beyond simple prejudice. The mutilations, the chemical treatment, it suggests something more, something about control, power.
That raises a really important question. What about those mutilations and the chemical treatments? Those details, they suggest something more complex, deeper than simple hatred, right?
Right.
What are some of the other theories?
Well, some investigators believe the killings were sexually motivated, pointing to the emasculation of the male victims. But that doesn't fully explain the dismemberment, the removal of heads, the use of chemicals, and it doesn't account for the female victims.
So we're left with a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah.
What other explanations are there?
Some of the more fringe theories delve into ritualistic or occult practices. Remember those strange symbols, the ones we talked about, found at some of the crime scenes?
Yes, tell me more about those.
Some believe that they might be connected to some sort of occult ritual, like the killer was trying to send a message or appease some dark force.
Right.
The chemical treatment could be seen as a way of preserving the bodies for some nefarious purpose. But again, there's no concrete evidence to support this.
It's all speculation.
It is.
But it definitely adds another layer of mystery to the case. What other explanations are there for the chemical treatment?
Well, some speculate that it wasn't about ritual at all, but about practicality.
Practicality, how so?
Well, think about it. If you're trying to dispose of a body, the smell of decomposition can be a big problem.
Oh, right.
Using chemicals could have been a way to mask the smell and buy the killer more time.
Oh, that is a disturbing thought. It suggests a level of premeditation and planning.
Yeah.
That is truly terrifying.
It is.
And it raises questions, like about the killer's background. Where would someone get access to these kinds of chemicals?
It circles back to the idea of the killer having medical training. or at least some familiarity with these substances.
Right.
Which leads us to one of the most intriguing aspects of this case. The investigation and the man who was brought in to solve it.
Eliot Ness.
Yes.
The man who brought down Al Capone. He was involved in this.
Eliot Ness had just been appointed Cleveland's public safety director when the Torso murders began. He was brought in to clean up the city. The pressure was on to solve this case.
So with all his experience and success, did Ness crack the case?
Sadly, no.
Oh, wow.
The Torso murders became Ness's biggest failure, a case that would haunt him for the rest of his life.
Wow.
But he did have a prime suspect.
Who was that?
A man named Dr. Francis Sweeney.
A doctor.
Yes.
That fits with what we were just talking about, what made him a suspect.
Well, Sweeney was a World War I veteran, a trained surgeon. He had experience treating soldiers with really horrific injuries, which could explain the precision of the dismemberments.
Right, right.
But there was more to it than just that.
What do you mean?
Sweeney was a deeply troubled individual, suffered from severe mental illness and alcoholism, and there was a family connection that made him even more suspicious.
A family connection. Tell me more.
2 of the victims were related to Sweeney's ex-wife, and there were rumors that Sweeney had threatened them in the past.
Oh, wow.
It was all circumstantial, but it was enough for Ness to take a serious look at him.
So what happened? Did they find any evidence linking Sweeney to the murders?
No, they didn't. Ness personally interrogated Sweeney, who reportedly mocked the investigators and behaved erratically. He even failed 2 polygraph tests.
The polygraphs weren't admissible in court at the time, were they?
That's right. And despite their suspicions, they never found anything conclusive. Sweeney was later committed to a mental institution where he remained for the rest of his life.
So even Eliot Ness, with all his experience, couldn't crack this case. Did they explore any other avenues, any other suspects?
They did. Remember the theory about the killer being a butcher or someone familiar with slaughterhouses?
Yeah.
Well, that led investigators to look into people working in those industries, but again, they hit a dead end. Some investigators even considered the possibility that the murders were the work of multiple killers, or even part of a larger criminal enterprise.
Like some kind of organized crime ring?
Precisely. They thought maybe the killings were connected to the city's underworld, a way of silencing informants or rivals.
But wouldn't something that organized have left more clues, more connections?
That's the thing.
It seems like this killer was operating in the shadows, almost like a ghost.
You're right. And that's part of what makes this case so enduringly fascinating. The Torso killer was a master of anonymity, a phantom who vanished into the fog of history. It's incredible and terrifying to think that someone could commit such atrocities and simply disappear.
The story doesn't end there, does it?
No, it doesn't. In 1938, with the city still on edge, Eliot Ness made a controversial decision that would have far-reaching consequences.
What did he do?
He ordered a raid on Kingsbury Run.
A raid? On the whole area?
Yeah. He sent police to round up vagrants and burn the shantytowns to the ground.
Burn them to the ground? That's drastic.
It was.
What was the thinking behind that?
Ness believed that by eliminating the environment where the killer was operating, he could stop the murders. It was a bold move, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation, but it was also incredibly controversial.
I can imagine. Displacing all those people, destroying their homes, it sounds more like a punishment than a solution. Did people see it that way?
Many did. They criticized Ness, accusing him of using the raid as a publicity stunt to show he was taking action, even if it was at the expense of the city's most vulnerable citizens.
So did the raid work? Did it stop the killings?
The Torso murders officially ended in 1938, shortly after the raid. But whether the 2 are directly related, well, it's debatable.
So the mystery remains.
It does.
This infamous mad butcher was never caught.
Never. The Cleveland Torso murders remain unsolved to this day.
It's a chilling thought, knowing that this killer, this monster, was never brought to justice. It makes you wonder what other secrets lie hidden in the shadows of history.
It's fascinating. While the murders officially ended in 1938, there were reports of similar crimes in nearby cities in the years that followed.
Really? So it's possible the killer simply moved on, continued his reign of terror elsewhere.
It's a possibility, and one that has fueled countless theories and speculation over the years.
Yeah.
It makes you think, if the Torso killer was never caught, could there be other unsolved cases out there?
Right.
Other victims whose stories remain untold?
Wow. That's That's a haunting thought. And it speaks to the enduring power of this case.
Yeah, it really does.
The Cleveland torso murders.
The Cleveland torso murders are a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human heart and the mysteries that may never be fully unraveled.
Well, that's a sobering thought to end on, but I think it's important to remember these stories, to learn from them, even if they leave us with more questions than answers.
You're absolutely right. These cases, as horrific as they are, can teach us about ourselves, about the societies we create, and about the enduring power of the unknown.
Yeah. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always those seeking truth, fighting for justice.
Absolutely.
And even though the torso killer was never caught, the victims have not been forgotten.
Their stories continue to be told, their lives continue to matter,
Yeah.
and perhaps someday the truth will finally come to light. We've talked about the victims and these horrifying methods the torso killer used, but what about the impact on Cleveland? I mean, it must have been profound.
Imagine living in a city where fear is, like, everywhere.
Yeah.
And you're afraid to even walk alone at night, let your kids out of your sight. I mean, the torso murders, it cast a long, dark shadow over Cleveland.
And we have to remember this is all happening during the Depression. People are already struggling, they're vulnerable.
Right.
And then the torso murders just amplifies that unease, that feeling that things are out of control.
Yeah, and for Eliot Ness, I mean, this is supposed to be his moment, right?
Yes.
Solidify his reputation as this crime fighter.
Right.
But instead, he's presiding over one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. I mean, what was that like for him?
I think the torso murders became Ness's white whale. He poured so many resources into the investigation, but nothing.
Wow.
Came up empty-handed. And it definitely tarnished his reputation, no matter how unfair that might seem.
It's a reminder that even the most celebrated lawmen, even the most brilliant minds, they can be stumped, right?
Absolutely.
By the darkness that just exists in the world. Did they ever determine what type of chemical was used to preserve the bodies?
The specific chemical, no, never definitively identified. But based on the coroner's reports and the knowledge at the time, it's believed to have been some type of formaldehyde-based solution. Formaldehyde was really available back then, commonly used for embalming, tissue preservation.
Does that change how you imagine the killer? Knowing it was something so readily available, does it make him seem more or less sinister?
It's a great question. On one hand, using a common chemical, it might suggest the killer wasn't as sophisticated, as connected as we imagine.
Right.
But on the other hand, the fact that they knew how to use it, chose to use it, that adds this whole other layer of premeditation to the crimes.
It's almost more disturbing to think that the killer might have been someone seemingly ordinary, right?
Yeah.
Just blending in like everyday life.
Absolutely. That's part of what makes this case so chilling. I mean, the killer wasn't this mythical monster. They were a human being, living, moving among the people of Cleveland.
So we've talked about the victims, the methods, the suspects, but what can we take away from this deep dive into, I guess, the heart of darkness?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that despite the darkness, the horror, the human spirit, it perseveres.
Yeah.
Cleveland survived the torso murders.
Right.
The city rebuilt, moved on, but they never forgot. The victims, often forgotten in life, they're remembered through this case.
It's true. Their stories are now intertwined with the city's history, almost like a cautionary tale, woven into the fabric of Cleveland.
Exactly. And it reminds us that evil can often hide in plain sight, disguised as normalcy. The torso killer wasn't this mythical monster, but a human being living among the people of Cleveland.
You know, it's interesting. We've talked about the possibility of the killer moving on to other cities,
Right.
committing similar crimes. But what if it wasn't just one killer?
That's a chilling thought. What if the brutality of the torso murders, it inspired others?
Right.
What if the darkness that he unleashed spread further than we can imagine?
It's a disturbing possibility and one that's really difficult to shake. It's a reminder that the impact of these crimes, they can ripple outward, right?
Absolutely.
Influencing events and individuals in ways that we may never fully understand.
It speaks to the power of fear, the ways in which violence can beget more violence. I mean, the torso murders created this atmosphere of terror in Cleveland.
Of course.
And maybe that terror, that sense of vulnerability, had a lasting impact, not just on the city, but beyond.
We may never know for sure if the torso killer inspired others or if those later crimes in nearby cities were purely coincidental.
Yeah.
But it raises questions, important ones, about the nature of evil and its potential to spread.
Absolutely. It forces us to confront this really uncomfortable reality. That darkness can be contagious, that acts of cruelty can have really far-reaching consequences, and maybe that's the most unsettling legacy of the Cleveland torso murders.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Cleveland torso murders, what's the final thought you want to leave our listener with?
The Cleveland torso murders are a stark reminder that there are mysteries that endure.
Yeah.
They challenge our understanding of human nature and the limits of justice.
Right.
And while the answers that we seek may never be fully revealed, the pursuit of truth and the act of remembering these victims, they're crucial. Their stories, as tragic as they must continue to be told.
I feel like we've covered so much in our deep dive into the Cleveland torso murders.
We have.
The victims, the killer's methods,
Right.
the suspects, the social context, even, what forensic science was like back then.
Yeah.
But even as we get to the end of our exploration, I still have this lingering unease,
It's understandable. I mean, this case, it really gets under your skin.
It does.
The brutality, the mystery, the fact that we still don't know who did it, it all makes for a really unsettling experience.
It makes you question everything.
Yeah.
What are some of the big takeaways you hope our listeners are walking away with?
One of the most important for me is this. Despite the darkness, the horror, the human spirit is strong.
Yeah.
Cleveland survived the torso murders. They rebuilt, they moved on, but they never forgot. And those victims, so often forgotten in life, they're remembered because of this case.
It's true. Their stories are part of the city's history now, almost like a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Like woven into the fabric of Cleveland.
Exactly. And it reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, right?
Yeah.
Disguised as normal. The torso killer, he wasn't some, mythical monster. He was a human being.
Right.
Living among the people of Cleveland.
It's interesting. We've talked about that possibility, right?
Yeah.
That he moved on to other cities,
Right.
committed similar crimes.
Yeah.
But what if it wasn't just him?
Mm-hmm.
What if it wasn't just one killer?
Ooh, that is a chilling thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
What if the brutality of the torso murders, what if it inspired copycats?
Right.
What if that darkness that he unleashed spread further than we know?
It's a disturbing possibility and one that's really hard to shake off.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's that reminder that these crimes, they ripple outwards.
Yeah.
They influence events and people in ways we might never understand.
It speaks to the power of fear, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And how violence can just create more violence. I mean, think about the torso murders. It created this atmosphere of terror in Cleveland.
Of course.
And maybe that terror, that feeling that everyone was vulnerable, maybe that had a lasting impact on the city and even beyond.
We may never know for sure, right, if he inspired other killers or if those later crimes in nearby cities were just coincidences. But it brings up these big questions about the nature of evil.
Absolutely.
And how it spreads.
It forces us to think about this uncomfortable truth that darkness can be contagious, that cruel acts can have huge consequences. And maybe that's the most unsettling legacy of the Cleveland torso murders.
So as we conclude our deep dive
Yeah.
into this haunting case, what final thought would you like to leave our listeners with?
I think the Cleveland torso murders are this stark reminder that some mysteries, they just endure. They challenge how we think about human nature and the limits of justice. And even though the answers we want, they might never be fully clear, the search for truth and remembering these victims, that's crucial. Their stories, as awful as they are, they have to keep being told.
Well said. It's a powerful reminder. Even with darkness and all these unanswered questions, we have to learn from the past. We have to remember those who are lost. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Cleveland torso murders. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the lights on.